This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother in Oklahoma City. Recently, there's been an outburst of commentary surrounding a new law in Louisiana concerning the posting of the Ten Commandments in classrooms around the state there. With this new law, it's now required for each school to post a copy of the Ten Commandments in each classroom so that, presumably, each child will be exposed to them and learn about them. This has been considered by many to be a real coup as far as state education is concerned, and they're all rejoicing in it. It's also occasioned a good deal of disagreement from many who are opposed to the content and to the context of this posting. It makes me wonder, does posting the Ten Commandments in a classroom actually do any good? It's not a bad thing to consider. As in most things, there's a wider context to it. At the establishment of public education, the Bible was widely taught as part of the normal curriculum. It wasn't considered an offense to the public to instantiate Christian faith as part of the educational experience of kids in public education. Bible reading was often a part of the daily schedule, and the days often began with a prayer. In many places, ministers were invited to teach classes or to lead discussion groups in the schools. And for a very long time, these practices were considered normal in many places throughout the country, although not in all. Schools were local, and they responded to local norms and regional expectations. In much of the first part of the 20th century, these practices were considered immemorial and were part of the educational scenery then. In fact, we Catholics presumed from the beginning such things were the norm. That's why the American bishops opted for Catholic schools whenever they could. From the Council of Baltimore in 1852, the bishops worked to develop their own schools and parishes so as to escape the practice of religious education in public school. In their experience, public school meant Protestant school, whose instruction included criticism of Catholic doctrine and practice. The bishops then wanted to be sure the children in their parishes were not steered away from the church or confused in their belief by the predominant educational materials of their classes and teachers. This outpouring of concern, along with the relative wealth of the country at large and the manpower there, and especially the woman power, the Catholic Church was able to bring, created the largest private school system in the world. The bishops thought religious education in public school had to be opposed by Catholic instruction in their own schools. It didn't all run in just one direction, however. Even in the mid-1970s, there were public schools in which Catholic catechism was taught. In fact, in southern Indiana, in a town near the seminary I attended, the public school there had sisters from the local convent teaching as part of the regular faculty. Catechism class was a regular feature of the school day. All of the Protestant students, all 8 of them in the grade school and high school, were excused from the classes, and the local Methodist minister taught them each day, while the Catholic kids were laboring over their studies of church history, sacraments, and doctrine. This also was an arrangement there from time immemorial. No one in town had a hard time with it. Public education in this place was an expression of the interests and history of the people there. But this changed, as we know, with the country's growing concern about the relationship of religious belief and public policy. There was a growing secularization in society, and more people became uncomfortable with the support of religious belief in public fora. This was made especially notable by a Supreme Court ruling in 1963 that made mandatory Bible reading and prayers in public school unconstitutional. As in many court rulings, this not only directed the practice of society, but it expressed an aspect of social life already present there. While the ruling brought no end of criticism, it was generally incorporated into public life so that at this remove in time, no one expects to hear the Bible read or prayers said in public school. Religious sectarianism in public school is, for the most part, considered a thing of the past. As William Donahue from the Catholic League has pointed out, most public schools bend over backwards to make sure they never get close to any endorsement of religious belief or practice in any way. This has become most evident even in Oklahoma, in which some schools won't allow the administration to place Christmas or Easter on the calendar, much less place a creche or a cross in a public space. Donahue has pointed out that these public expressions of faith and practice are specifically protected by legal precedent, but they're usually eschewed by administrators so as to avoid any hint of controversy or conflict with those who are not supportive of any religious content in public education or public discourse. As many people have pointed out, it's now common to find people substitute the statement freedom of religion with freedom of belief or freedom of worship, or in some cases, freedom from religion. These substitutions are very much different from the freedom of religion, since that freedom includes the public and institutional instantiation of belief rather than the personal and private expressions presumed in these other expressions. What good is the freedom of belief if it can be held only in private, or the freedom of religious expression if it's limited only to church on Sunday or prayers at the dining room table? It is more than nothing, but only barely. Which leads us to the controversy now swirling about the posting of the Ten Commandments. Without a doubt, this effort was spearheaded by those in Louisiana who wanted to reverse the trend of the privatization of religion so as to make it more explicit and more public. They wanted public education to become more explicitly supportive of religious content and of religious learning. And so they've made it a requirement that all students see the new postings in their classrooms. Their presumption is that this education is important and necessary, and without it, the children won't be exposed to the basis of good living and their education will be impaired. For them, it's an effort to do good for those in their charge. In addition, the Ten Commandments have a place in the history of our country. The law also encourages the posting of other foundational documents in classrooms as well, including the Declaration of Independence and the Mayflower Compact. Rather than religious sectarianism, the emphasis of the legislation is also directed to address concerns about historical precedent and foundational understandings of our nationhood. But it begins with the Ten Commandments. Now, this effort is not the first. Several years ago, there were parallel efforts to have the Ten Commandments placed at state legislatures and at public buildings around the country. In many of the county buildings around the state of Oklahoma, these efforts are now obvious. This was a national effort. It didn't always have a national effect, but it was successful in some venues. In fact, it sparked its own controversy in Georgia, as I recall. The controversy sprang up because there was a successful effort by a group of people to have the tablets of the Ten Commandments removed from the Georgia State House because its presence was an offense to the people there, not all of whom, it is presumed, agreed with the efficacy of their presence or what their presence indicated when it came to religious belief or religious adherence. On its surface, the controversy seemed to encapsulate the ongoing secularization going on throughout society, and it seemed to make for the perfect example of the delegitimizing of religion in public life. I wondered why, when I first heard of this, the presence of the Ten Commandments had suddenly become so offensive to those who passed them every day. Surely, most everyone had heard of them and would scarcely have a visceral disgust of them. After all, even a dedicated atheist could hardly have a hard time disagreeing with prohibitions against murder, stealing, covetousness, adultery, and lying. While offenses against these commandments were not exactly unknown in the Georgia State House, most people would generally be opposed to sinning against them, at least in public, and wouldn't mind saying so. And as for the dedicated atheists, it wouldn't be that much of an offense to prohibit the worship of false gods, since they believe in no gods at all. The teeth-grinding resentment against having the commandments on public display seemed odd to me. Besides, had they done all that much harm over all the years they'd stood there, reminding the legislators of the decrees of good order? I couldn't understand it. Well, I couldn't until I found out that the monument that had been placed there had been placed only 1 year before. Georgia had managed independence from England, becoming a cornerstone of the Confederacy, reintegration into the Union, the world wars, the dark history of Jim Crow, the bright lights of civil rights, and the explosive growth of its capital city into a worldwide center of commerce and art, and all without a graven copy of the Ten Commandments in the lobby of its state capitol. True, perhaps it would have been a better place had this monument been there to remind everyone of its provenance, but the state seemed to have gotten along without it for some time. Those who wanted it removed had a point, even if they were content to leave it as an historical one. And the point was, why not leave well enough alone and leave the monument out of it? And what were the guys who invested so much energy and money in placing it thinking? Did they really think having this stone in the middle of the building really make that much of a difference there? Apparently they did, but what would the point be? As it turned out, they couldn't find out because it was removed by order of the court. So, of course, for them, it was a symbol. The Ten Commandments weren't there in order to instruct anyone concerning the Jewish or Christian moral ethos or to help anyone settle a nagging question of behavior. It was placed at the state capitol in order to claim a presence among those who make decisions in the name of the people of Georgia. The granite slab's purpose was to signal a notion of moral identification outside the concourse of political give and take, and to claim that there is more to the exercise of good and bad in life than expediency or compromise. They symbolize an appeal to a standard of behavior and an understanding of adherence greater than just what a person wants today. Their placement is to remind everyone of a history of moral guidance and a sense of moral presence that transcends the vicissitude of contesting values. And in all of this, the appeal to these commandments is less about observing them strictly than it is about honoring them generally. When they were placed, they were a symbol of those who wanted to see these values recognized in this place where the business of the state is enacted. As purely symbols, of course, they're ambiguous. This is not because they're commandments, but because all symbols carry with them meanings and shades of interpretation that are open and expansive. At the same time they describe what God wants of His people, they remind everyone of the tradition of American exceptionalism and its founding as an expression of the Pilgrim's notion of being God's chosen. They're also reminders of history and purpose when religion had a place of respect and impact in American society. They're also at the same time reminders to those who would change things and alter the norms of regular society that there are considerations other than feelings and convictions in polls or coalitions. And while all of these meanings are inherent, they also carry the accusation that even the great historical figures who have made us didn't always live up to their exigencies. They remind everyone of failure and hypocrisy and foolishness. But because they are symbols, they communicate these meanings and many others all at the same time and at many different levels all at the same time. So if you want to get a bang for your buck, there's nothing like symbols and nothing like these symbols. They communicate and over-communicate. Thus, their removal was a symbolic act as well. Having been placed there, the energy to take them away was also a decision that communicated a bushel of meanings to everyone. Insisting the state could live without the reminder didn't absolve anyone from making the case that reminders were necessary. Calling them unnecessary or sectarian also didn't absolve anyone from being reminded that these commandments have shaped the lives of billions of people over thousands of years, and might therefore have a place in a system and a society that places value in acceptance, tolerance, and meaning. The Louisiana decision to place the commandments is a direct symbolic act as well. The legislatures wanted to communicate that they view as notable and important the recognition of a system of values and laws by which the people of the state participate in an ordered society. These commandments are historical. They animated those who founded the country and organized the state, and would have been recognized as authoritative by everyone throughout all of the years of the state's existence. To this end, they are a reminder of those who have been a part of the governance of the state from the beginning. But in addition, they are also a description of an ideal of ordered personal life that contributes to the good of all persons. Keeping these commandments makes for a better society in which everyone does better. The legislators wanted to communicate that the good order of the state begins at the personal and magnifies through the collective. A good life, lived in an ordered way, makes life good for everyone. As a symbolic act, it is greater than simply providing information to unwary students. If it were the case that someone didn't know about the commandments, they could easily find them on the internet or just ask around, and their ultimate value is something more than merely providing the knowledge kids might need somewhere in their education and formation. Posting them publicly signals a state-sized stamp of approval on them and on the messages they convey. A message that is much larger than simply affirming the content of their information. The state is shouting its desire to make sure every student and every parent of students knows it thinks these are something of importance. So they opt for a copy to be posted in every classroom. And we all know that putting them in public is no guarantee that they'll be observed with any devotion or alacrity. Symbols are not magic. Think of the Catholic classrooms all over the world adorned with crucifixes and statues. These symbols of faith and devotion by themselves seem to have little effect on turning the minds and hearts of students to the life of Christ, if all they are hangings and ornaments. Think also of the American flag hanging in classrooms all over the country. This does not turn anyone's mind automatically to love of nation or appreciation of our history. Symbols as symbols can be ignored as easily as stop signs, calorie counts, and cigarette pack warnings, and can be ignored just as easily. There has also been a great deal of pushback to this initiative. I saw a video of a teacher who thought it would be funny to have the students spend 10 minutes each day pointing out when legislators and the famous characters of history have not lived up to the commandments. She thought this would undermine them as helpful reminders. Doing this, of course, would remind everyone of the importance of having an ideal of good order constantly before us. Another person sarcastically suggested that the 5 pillars of Islam should be posted in every classroom. That should be a necessary reminder of good order as well. Of course, he made the suggestion as a way to cause everyone to grind their teeth at describing the tenets of religion. But of course, Islam did not shape the founding of the United States or the structure of the governance and good order of the state of Louisiana. And most of the other responses I've seen fall into these nattering categories. The most interesting response has been the insistence that the state should not promote any religious values, which it is doing to an obvious extent by posting these most famous religious statements. After all, they're from the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy. They don't come from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Putting these in classrooms promotes religion and should not be permitted to infect the minds of school kids, these critic whine. If parents wanted kids to learn religious lessons, they should send them to religious schools and not turn public schools into religious centers. That's the substantive complaint. Those who are upset see this as the beginning of a possible trend to push religion back into public spaces where it does not belong. And they have a point. The state is making the case that the values of order and restraint described in the Ten Commandments are important to it. The legislators want these values to be recognized and affirmed for what they are, and they want to do this as the voice of the state. Those who complain are right, but they're only half right, because in their complaints they presume the state has no right to denominate its values at all. They complain as if the choice were between this value, which they think is odious, and no value, which they consider would be better. But there is no such thing as no value or no support or no instruction in what is valuable. Those who complain will have to book their complaints on the level of which values they deem important, rather than to complain that the state is teaching some of them. It's not possible to live with no values, and thus it's not possible to teach no values. As many people have mentioned, in many public schools, and I might also say in many venues that seem to have no connection to the point in question, including the screen on the ATM at my local bank. The pride flag has been hoisted in many public schools to indicate communal support of the values of these sets of sexual preferences and practices. It has not been common to hear of complaints concerning the values instantiated in these symbols, at least not from those who now complain that the state shouldn't teach values. But set this example aside. There are 100 others. If a school chooses to place an article cut out from the newspaper on the bulletin board of its classrooms each week, so as to remind the students to read it and to think about it, the school is teaching those students not only the topic of current interest, but also that this source of information, the newspaper, is reliable and trustworthy. That's a choice of value and emphasis. If a school punishes students for arriving late, or not at all, the school is instantiating a series of values concerning time and responsibility that excludes other values like flexibility and accommodation. And the mere fact of having a curriculum is to choose to teach some things and exclude others. Imagining there be no values or that the school should be forbidden in teaching them is not just foolish, it's impossible. And many of those who complain know this. Their upset is at the values these commandments instantiate. They want to see them overthrown or privatized, that is to say, out of the public forum. They don't want them recognized as communal values or collective agreements. Rather, they want to push them to the side, away from the inclination or the temptation to regard them as necessary or important. If we could get an inch below the surface, I think we'd find that they regard them as examples of cruel limitations and religious excess, especially when it comes to the sixth commandment. But of course, in this complaint against limits and narrow thinking, the contest is not between these values and no values, but between this commandment and other more congenial, if less well-known commandments. But they figure, as long as we're talking only about the one set to be posted in schoolrooms, we need not worry about imposing the other sets. By which values will we live? This question is the central one for all of us everywhere. Louisiana legislators think they've found a way to talk about an answer. It may not be the final answer, but at least it's contributing to the conversation. Maybe it's a conversation we ought to have. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called, Have You Noticed? Have you noticed that when you age, suddenly you can step out of your cage and be the person the other one there sees without all that prompts so much anxiety? I should be insulted a bit, I guess, that others would look and see but then digress from the obvious and open I am for them and invest in what they distort and bend. Because with age, we become harmless now, no longer threaten or hinder, and so allow another to be comfortable with who we have become, thus being for the first time the real person in some. Of course, so we have been really always. They just could never see us, but sideways. So here's to sagging wattles and gray hair, or none. At least we're fully being treated with some fun. That's Have You Noticed? We're here at Living Catholic every week, trying to dive into what makes the process of our encounter with Christ and our life in Him valuable and important. Hope you can join us in the weeks to come.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.